When the laughter fades, what remains? Is it applause, or silence? Is it the character we loved, or the man behind him? On January 30th, 2026, Demond Wilson, forever remembered as Lamont Sanford, passed away at 79 after complications from cancer. For millions who grew up in the 1970s, his face was as familiar as the evening news. He stood patiently beside Fred Sanford's bluster, absorbing the insults, steadying the chaos, and giving American television one of its most memorable father-son dynamics. But when Wilson's final curtain fell, something unexpected happened. There was no red carpet, no television cameras, no gathering of surviving co-stars offering tearful tributes. His funeral was private, reserved for family and a small circle of trusted friends. And that absence sparked a question many viewers quietly asked. Where was everyone? To understand the silence, we have to look beyond headlines and return to what Wilson truly represented, not just to Hollywood, but to a generation now in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who remember sitting in living rooms where canned laughter echoed against wood-paneled walls, where antennae were adjusted by hand, and where families gathered at the same hour each week because television was not yet fragmented into algorithms and streaming queues. It was shared. It was communal. It was ritual. And in that ritual, one show stood tall. The man America knew as Lamont. When Sanford and Son premiered in 1972, it did more than entertain. Developed by Norman Lear and Bud Yakin, the show adapted the British series Steptoe and Son but relocated its heart to Watts, Los Angeles, inside a working-class black household navigating pride, poverty, generational tension, and the shifting cultural tides of post-civil rights America. At the center were two unforgettable forces. Redd Foxx as Fred Sanford, sharp-tongued, theatrical, explosive. Demond Wilson as Lamont, calm, grounded, quietly resilient. Fred hurled the now legendary line, "You big dummy!" Lamont endured it, with dignity. But Lamont wasn't weak. He represented something deeper, a younger generation striving for stability in a country still wrestling with integration, economic inequality, and cultural identity. He was patient without being passive, loyal without losing himself, ambitious without abandoning his roots. For many viewers, Lamont wasn't just a sitcom character. He was familiar. A son trying to respect a stubborn father. A young man wanting more than the life he inherited. A bridge between eras. And that familiarity is why Wilson's passing felt personal. Because in remembering Lamont, people weren't just remembering punchlines. They were remembering themselves. Growing up before the spotlight. Long before he stepped into the cluttered junkyard set, before studio lights bounced off metal scrap and artificial laughter filled the room, Demond Wilson was a boy from Valdosta, Georgia, raised in Harlem. He had performed at the Apollo Theater by age 12. Imagine that for a moment, a child standing backstage at the Apollo, heart-pounding, listening to the roar of a crowd that could lift you to stardom or boo you into obscurity. What does that kind of pressure do to a young mind? Does it harden you, sharpen you, teach you resilience before you can even define the word? Wilson served in the U.S. Army. He experienced the turbulence of the 1960s not just through headlines, but firsthand. The Vietnam era left scars on many young men. Wilson rarely sensationalized his service, but those who knew him described a man disciplined, reflective, and spiritually searching. By the time Hollywood called, he wasn't naive. He had seen struggle. He had known instability. He understood performance, but he also understood life outside the stage. That depth showed in Lamont. There was a seriousness behind the humor, a subtle gravity that made the character believable. The chemistry that couldn't be scripted. On screen, Fred and Lamont's dynamic felt effortless. But chemistry like that is rarely accidental. Redd Foxx was already a seasoned comedian, famous on the Chitlin circuit for decades before television discovered him. He commanded the room. His humor was sharp, sometimes risky, often improvised. Wilson, younger and classically trained, provided structure. Timing. Restraint. Opposites, yes, but complementary. Yet tension simmered beneath the laughter. During the show's second season, Fox temporarily walked off set over salary disputes. The move shocked producers and placed unexpected pressure on Wilson. Suddenly, Lamont wasn't just the steady son, He was carrying storylines, anchoring scenes, stabilizing a production machine that could not afford to stall. In his 2009 memoir, Second Banana, Wilson admitted he felt hurt. But he also wrote something revealing. "I forgave him and still loved Red Fox." Pause there. In an era where celebrity feuds fuel headlines for decades, that sentence stands out. No public smear campaigns. No social media rants. Just acknowledgement and forgiveness. How many of us hold on to resentment longer than the moment requires? How often does pride prevent reconciliation? Wilson's response hinted at maturity rarely spotlighted. Conflict does not always equal hatred. Distance does not always mean betrayal. A show that shifted culture. To understand Wilson's cultural footprint, we must remember the television landscape of the early 1970s. America was still healing, unevenly, from the civil rights movement. Representation on screen was evolving but fragile. Sanford and Son presented a working-class black family without romanticizing poverty or sanitizing conflict. The junkyard wasn't glamorous. The arguments weren't gentle. But the love, though disguised in sarcasm, was unmistakable. The show's success challenged networks' assumptions about what audiences would embrace. It ran for 6 seasons. It influenced later series centered on black families and urban life. But it also existed within limits. Creative control remained largely with producers. Black actors gained visibility, but not always authority. Wilson understood that tension. He navigated it carefully. Have you ever thrived in a system that still constrained you? Felt gratitude and limitation at the same time? That duality defined much of Wilson's career. The shadow of a signature role. When a role becomes iconic, it can become a cage. After the series ended in 1977, Wilson worked steadily. Guest appearances, film roles, stage work. Yet casting directors often saw only Lamont. The industry tends to simplify. It brands. It reduces decades of skill into one defining image. To audiences, Lamont was beloved. To executives, Lamont was marketable, but limiting. Imagine dedicating your life to craft, only to be asked repeatedly to replay one chapter. Would you embrace it? Resist it? Redefine yourself entirely? Wilson chose reinvention, a turn toward faith. In later years, Wilson stepped away from Hollywood's glare. He became a minister. He founded a ministry. He spoke about faith with conviction. For him, spirituality wasn't a publicity pivot, it was a calling. He once described surviving a near-fatal accident as a turning point, a moment that clarified purpose beyond fame. The industry he left behind had changed dramatically. Faster production cycles, celebrity branding, constant exposure. Wilson preferred privacy. He did not chase nostalgia tours aggressively. He did not center his identity around reruns. By the time he died, he was no longer seeking applause. And perhaps that explains the funeral. Those who attended weren't there for Lamont. They were there for Demond, the husband, the father, the pastor. What does it say about a life when the most important audience is not the public, but the intimate circle that truly knows you? Why was the funeral so quiet? Let's confront the question directly. By 2026, nearly every principal cast member of Sanford and Son had passed away. Red Fox died in 1991. LaWanda Page, Aunt Esther, passed in 2002. Whitman Mayo, Grady, died in 2001. Nathaniel Taylor passed in 2019. Lynn Hamilton died in 2025. Wilson wasn't abandoned. He was the last one standing. More than 50 years had passed since the show's debut. Time, not scandal, had emptied those seats. Still, the quiet felt heavy. Why? Because television creates the illusion of permanence. We see characters argue, laugh, reconcile. We assume the bond must endure beyond studio lights. But Hollywood friendships often resemble workplace relationships, intense during the project, distant afterward. Have you ever left a job where colleagues felt like family, only to realize proximity created the bond more than permanence? The silence at Wilson's funeral may not reflect neglect. It may reflect reality, the weight of generational memory. For those who watched in the 1970s, Wilson's passing felt like losing a piece of youth. The show aired in an era before smartphones, before endless channels, before attention was fractured. Families gathered. Conversations followed episodes. Parents explained jokes children didn't fully understand. Grandparents laughed knowingly at generational clashes. The junkyard became a stage for discussing pride, money, respect, and aspiration. Today's media landscape rarely recreates that shared simultaneity. So when Wilson died quietly, it symbolized more than one man's passing. It marked the fading of a communal era. And that realization unsettles us. If the icons of our shared past leave quietly, what does that say about our own trajectory? Who will gather when our curtain falls? Beyond the laughter. Lamont Wilson's life invites reflection. He experienced fame, but did not cling to it. He endured tension, but practiced forgiveness. He embodied a character millions loved, yet refused to be consumed by him. In the end, perhaps the quiet funeral was not a failure of recognition, but a testament to choice. He chose privacy. He chose faith. He chose family. And maybe that is the deeper question his passing leaves behind. When the laughter fades in our own lives, what will remain? Applause from distant admirers? Or gratitude from those who truly knew us? Lamont Wilson gave television one of its most enduring sons. But in stepping away from the spotlight, he reminded us that identity is not confined to a role, even an iconic one. The screen goes dark. The credits roll. The audience moves on. But somewhere, beyond cameras, beyond reruns, a life was lived fully, quietly, and on its own terms. And perhaps, in that silence, there is dignity. Those two lines are a small lantern in a long, familiar corridor of light. They point toward a man who lived inside one of television's most recognizable living rooms and yet, in private, preferred the small comforts. A slow cup of coffee, a book put down mid-sentence, the soft way a neighborhood street sounds after midnight. He was, at once, a public figure and a private life. That tension, between the laugh track and the solitary lamp, shapes the story we keep telling about him. When the subject is the show that changed expectations about who could carry primetime, we must name it, Sanford and Son. It's easy to reduce such a program to punchlines and catchphrases, but inside its frames lived messy human beings, characters who argued, nagged, loved, and survived. Those human energies were amplified by an actor who, off-screen, preferred to be measured rather than magnified, Lamont Wilson, who gave the world Lamont Sanford. Lamont, the son, the foil, the patient younger man, is also a character in his own right, Lamont Sanford. He was the steadying presence, less given to thunderous gags than to a weary wisdom that anchored his father's storms. On screen, the interplay between Lamont and his father made audiences laugh and, sometimes, wince. Off-screen, the actor who inhabited Lamont lived a life that seemed to answer a different set of values: restraint, privacy, and an aversion to spectacle. To fully grasp his legacy, we have to travel back a little, to the early 1970s, when American television's default image of family life was narrow and comfortable. Into that space arrived a show that refused to erase the rough edges. It did not smooth out poverty. It did not sanitize conflict. It did not pretend life in Watts was easy. Instead, it used humor as a scalpel, precise, sometimes uncomfortable, and often revealing. By putting a working-class black family at the center of a national audience, it asked viewers to see a different America. That show did more than provoke laughter. It opened a door. Other series, like Good Times and The Jeffersons, would push representation further, complicate it, and sometimes soften its edges. Decades later, series such as Blackish, Insecure, and Atlanta would reclaim creative control in ways earlier generations could only imagine. But the paradox remains: opening a door does not mean owning the house. Those who performed the breakthrough often did not sit at the decision-making tables that followed. This is where personal history meets institutional truth. Wilson belonged to the generation that opened the road, but did not always reap its rewards. For years, actors of color could be the faces audiences loved while the executives, writers, and producers retained the power to shape stories. That mismatch produced moments of triumph and of quiet, acerbic bitterness. How do you take full credit for changing a landscape when some of the people who benefit later never knew your name? How do you live when the applause fades and the industry moves on? His funeral felt quiet, and that quietness said more than any headline could. Funerals can be loud acts, parades of celebrity, platitudes, and media brightness. But this one was small, intimate, and deeply human. The low number of public tributes was not a statement about worth. It was a statement about a life lived without needing to stage its own memorial. Why do we expect spectacle at the end of a life that mostly preferred stillness? Is grandeur the only way to show gratitude? Or does silence sometimes say more? Think about the ritual of the living room. Once, families gathered around one screen and shared a collective rhythm. In those moments, television functioned as a civic space. Did anyone else feel the peculiar comfort of laughing together at the same time? Does that shared experience have a cultural cost, the flattening of nuance in the service of broad appeal? With streaming, the era of simultaneous viewing has waned. Shows now accumulate audiences atomically rather than communally. When the screen goes dark, how does society remember a performer who embodied a communal moment we no longer share? Fred and Lamont, the on-screen family, felt inseparable. They argued, they bickered, but love pulsed underneath. Viewers read that love as authenticity, but off-screen relationships are rarely as simple. Professional bonds are negotiated by contracts, ratings, and the quiet calculus of career survival. When the show ended, the structure that bound them vanished. What remained depended on cups of coffee, unspoken apologies, and choices made in the solitude of life off-set. Wilson chose forgiveness, not nostalgia. He did not chase reunions or build a public identity hinged on past glory. He lived quietly. What does it mean to choose peace over pageantry? Is that a retreat, or a mature realignment of priorities? Character development matters not only on screen but in how an actor navigates the aftermath of fame. In private, Wilson curated a life that was small but rich. Long walks, deliberate conversations, friendships that did not require press releases. And in that inward life, he cultivated a dignity that television could not script. When people ask, did he find contentment? We must listen to what contentment now looks like, sometimes modest, sometimes resolute. There is dignity in retiring from the spotlight without shame. There is also a kind of loss, for the audience and for the industry. When the last of a generation passes, it takes with it not only memory but a set of tacit lessons, about timing, about how to fold humor into social criticism, about the day-to-day labor of making a show feel like family. Who will teach those lessons now that live mentors are fewer? Can a streaming platform replicate the apprenticeship that happened on set, where improvisation and empathy were learned in takes between lines? If not, how will future actors learn the craft of balancing comedy and dignity? The legacy of that era is both visible on screen and hidden in choices made off. For every triumphant career arc, there are quieter stories of individuals who refused the siren call of constant self-promotion. Does the world reward that? Not always. But perhaps it should. A life lived fully and privately can be a radical act of self-possession in an age where identity is often a public commodity. So what does his passing mean for us? It means the end of a television era, an era when the nation could gather, all at once, around a single program and share a common reference point. It means the slow fading of a community of artists whose work was forged in a different industry culture. It also offers us a moment to ask, how do we honor pioneers who opened the road but did not receive all the rewards? By naming them, by teaching their craft, by protecting the quiet dignity they chose, or by simply watching the reruns and trying to hear what they were trying to say beneath the jokes. Lamont Sanford lives in reruns. The laughter continues. New viewers discover the show on modern platforms and respond to it through lenses different from those of the 1970s. They find humor, they notice the rough edges, and they ask new questions about representation and authorship. But Demond Wilson, the man, was mourned by a small, intimate circle. That smallness is not tragedy, it is reality. It is the honest conclusion for many who never wanted their lives to become perpetual performances. And perhaps there is something dignified about that. When you strip away the bright lights and the cameras, you can ask dangerous, important questions. Which parts of our lives are stagecraft, and which parts are truth? Who among us will be remembered only as an echo of a character, and who will be remembered for the choices they made off-camera? When your final curtain falls, who will fill the seats, out of obligation, curiosity, or love? The laughter continues. The reruns play. The memory remains. If legacy is a sum of small, repeated acts rather than a single headline, then Demond Wilson's quiet life, his refusal to trade privacy for applause, counts as a kind of wealth. It is the wealth of a life lived on its own terms. So, as the screen goes dark and the credits roll, take a moment to ask, what would it mean to live with that kind of quiet dignity, to let your life be rich enough that you need not prove it? And who in your life deserves a farewell that's true rather than theatrical? In the end, the story is not only about hits and syndication. It's about a man who embodied patience, restraint, and a gentle strength that didn't require an audience to validate it. If that is legacy enough, then perhaps the silence is not emptiness but a full room of things that mattered in ways headlines never could.